As a part of the outreach ministry of the First Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana, we are pleased to present our pastor, William E. Hull, speaking from the church's pulpit.
The biggest thing that's happened in the Christian church for 2,000 years is what we call the Reformation. The Reformation was like an explosion of pent-up concerns. We went back and saw how people like John Wycliffe and John Huss were willing to give their lives to be burned at the stake, to be ahead of their times. But last week we looked at the tallest volcano of that eruption, a man named Martin Luther, who for years spewed out the hot lava of fresh convictions, new understandings. He was like a sort of avalanche, to change the metaphor a little, covering the landscape with a new approach to God and a new understanding of Christianity. That's fascinating. It's dramatic. You think almost in a generation, 1,000 years of Christianity was swept aside and something else was put in its place. But you know, we really can't live in a house by the side of a volcano. Finally, eruptions have to settle down to normal. Finally, somebody has to institutionalize the passions of a person's heart. And that is where the man we're going to look at tonight in our Heroes of Faith comes in. His name was John Calvin. He was of the opposite temperament to Luther. He was not explosive and talkative, and he did not seize sudden initiatives. Instead, he was quiet, logical, organized. He was not an innovator. He did not start the Reformation, not one of its launchers. For example, well, let's see, he was, I think I wrote that down somewhere. Yes, he was 8 years old when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door. Or he was 12 years old when Luther took his stand at the Diet of Worms and said, "Here I stand, God help me, I cannot do otherwise." So not an innovator, he was a formulator. He explained it. He put it in bureaucracy and in books and in understandings that would endure. And for that reason, even though he was not a pathfinder, a pacemaker, most people think he had a greater influence than any other reformer. Now, you're going to know probably, if you don't already, he's the father of the Presbyterian Church. So what we call the Reformed movement or the Presbyterian Church goes directly back to John Calvin. I'm fascinated that you begin to think about him because he is having a new and unsettling influence in Baptist life today. For example, some of you in this room have been part of some discussions I've had. There are some home Bible studies being held right here in Shreveport that are basically teaching hyper-Calvinism. In other words, they're basically centering their teaching on predestination to election or predestination to damnation. You might say, "Oh, I haven't heard that in a long time." Well, if you hadn't, you're just not in that circle. But there is kind of a revival of that theology today. Others of you have read in the Baptist press about one of the professors in Louisville named Dale Moody, who the trustees just met to act on a case of questions about some of his teaching. Well, you need to know that Calvinism is the central theological issue in the differences that some people have had with Dr. Moody. Because more than any other single thing, he is not endorsing Calvinism, but is raising some very serious questions and is frankly rejecting some of the heritage of John Calvin. So I think Baptists need to take a fresh look, even though we're not Presbyterians, because we have never had, as Baptists, any theologian as great as Luther and Calvin. We just haven't been great theologians. And so most of our theology is borrowed. And two of the people that we have borrowed from a great deal are Luther and Calvin, and Calvin's the one to talk about tonight. Well, let's take a moment to look at his early life and then the highlights of his career. He was born in 1509. Remember, Luther was back in 1483. And he was born in France, about 50 miles northeast of Paris. So that's the north-central part of France, in a very church-dominated city. The biggest thing in Noyon, N-O-Y-O-N, France, was the cathedral and the bishop. In fact, Calvin's father was a notary, and in that day that's kind of the same thing as an attorney. And he was the notary for the bishop, and therefore the attorney for the cathedral chapter, which meant the ruling leaders of that cathedral. This caused him to have very influential contacts, which meant that John Calvin was raised with a little bit more aristocracy, a little bit more refinement than any other of the reformers. He spoke a more elegant Latin and French and had more culture than the others. His father intended him for a church career and sent him off to the University of Paris to do that. But meanwhile, his father fell out with the church cathedral group, and so he told his son to go up and get a law degree. So he moved from Paris to Orleans and spent 3 years and earned a doctorate in law when he was 20, by the time he was 23 years of age. He then went back to the University of Paris, plunged into the humanities, became a master of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, and by the time he was 23, he had not only gotten a doctorate in law and a doctorate in classics, but had written his first book, which was a commentary on one of Seneca's treatises. Well, at about that point, he was studious, serious, brilliant, pious. He was mainly a great scholar of the classics of the humanities, and he had a profound religious conversion. Now, by that I mean he'd always gone to church. Of course, Catholics were baptized from birth. He got into a group that was reading what Luther and Melanchthon, the German reformers, were doing, and he began to take Scripture with tremendous seriousness, so much so that he said the Bible must be the absolute rule of authority in all matters of life. All of life, and we'll come back to that later. Because of this, he was drawn in sympathies to those who had reform ideas over in France. Of course, Luther was so Germanic that he wasn't having much influence in France. One of these, a certain Nicholas Kopp, C-O-P, a doctor, shared some of his views, and he was made the rector of the University of Paris. When he gave his inaugural address, he collaborated with Calvin, and there were a lot of reformer ideas in that address, but the faculty took it so negatively that both Kopp and Calvin were driven out of town, and they had to flee from arrest and kind of go into hiding briefly. So for about 2 years, from 1534 to 6, Calvin traveled all over France, rather incognito. He was studying theology, he was hiding out, but he was clearly being pushed by the chain of events out of the Catholic Church. So he went back up to his home. One interesting thing there were a lot of little tiny chapels out in the countryside that were endowed. But Catholicism had fallen on such a low estate that they didn't have preachers. So what did they do with the endowment money? They used the earnings to educate young people, and Calvin's father had gotten him the benefices, as it was called, from 2 or 3 of these chapels. So he signaled his break with Catholicism by going back to his hometown and relinquishing his special gratuities that had come to him from these little Catholic chapels. Be sort of like in our case, you know, the Caddo Baptist Mission closed. One of our friends gave us some money in our will for that. Cotton Valley Syndicate shares, we get about $20 or $30 a year for that, so we could send somebody to college. You see, for that, since they're no longer in business. Well, by that time, deciding that he could no longer be a good Catholic, relinquishing these ties, and by the way, he might have done it because his father never reconciled with that cathedral chapter. He finally ended up being excommunicated, and when he died, he had a hard time getting buried on holy ground. So Calvin and his family were not in good terms with the Catholic Church. Well, while he was traveling and looking for a place to settle in, the King of France, Francis I, this is up to 1535 now, he issued a letter critical of the Reformation. And he said, all of the French that have reform ideas are anarchists. They are bad citizens. They're treasonous. Well, of course, that was slanderous. So, John Calvin, now up to age 25, decided that he would answer the King of France. So while he was traveling, he wrote a little book. When he had studied law, his number one textbook was Justinian's Institutes, which means the foundational institutions of society. Calvin sat down and wrote a book, and he called it The Institutions of the Christian Religion. But we usually translate it the Christian Institutes. And to this little book, which later became a great big book as he expanded it, he wrote a letter to the king that is one of the literary masterpieces of the Reformation period. And he basically, very elegantly and brilliantly said, O king, I know you have attacked us. You haven't given us a fair hearing. Read this book, and you will see that our beliefs go back through all of Christianity to the Bible, and it is rather the Catholic Church that has strayed from the faith. We are the true church. The book was published the next year in Basel when Calvin was 26 years old. I don't know whether you've ever heard of that book. Let me test you. How many of you have ever heard of the Institutes, John Calvin's Institutes? Well, a few. That is the most famous book of the Reformation. It is probably the most influential systematic theology ever written by anybody. It was written in Latin, but then Calvin himself translated it into French. It is a literary masterpiece. It is a theological masterpiece. It is probably his most enduring contribution. Well, the publication of that book clearly established Calvin at 26 years of age as the brightest mind of the French-speaking Reformation, like Luther, of course, was the brightest mind of the German Reformation. So he moved on down into Switzerland, where the Protestants were not persecuted, first in Basel, and then over to Geneva. How many of you have been to Geneva? Oh, that's even more. Well, John Calvin, from this point on, a little over all the rest of his life, becomes synonymous with the city of Geneva. There was a reformer there named William Farel, F-A-R-E-L, who wanted to reform Geneva. In other words, as a city, he wanted to make it a Reformation town. And he begged Calvin to come. Farel was the fiery preacher, and Calvin was the cool, analytical brain. And he said, let's the two of us reform Geneva. So they did. They got themselves made the ministers of the one big, cathedral church. They wrote a creed. They wrote a catechism to be taught in the schools. And they wrote up rules for a council or a consistory, which is the same thing as that we would call a presbytery, which was to run the city. The only problem was that the people weren't quite ready. They did that within the first year, and by the second year they had run both of them out of town, banned them. So Calvin and Farel had to go off to Strasbourg, where, by the way, Calvin spent 3 years in exile as the pastor of a French refugee church, and he said they by far the happiest years of his life. He found a wife there and married. Unfortunately, they had only one child who died in infancy. The wife soon became invalid, and after 9 years, she died. So home life and married relation was never an important part of his life. As someone said of Calvin, he was not married to his wife, but to his work. By the time he had been 3 years away, though, the people in Geneva who were backers of Calvin had gotten back in power. In other words, they had pushed out the people that had run him off. So they rescinded the bans that had kicked Calvin out. They frankly begged him to come back, and he came back on his own terms. Now you need to understand, this is in 1541, and he died in 1564. So for the next 22 to 3 years, Calvin was the most important person in the city of Geneva. He expanded the catechism and made one of the officers the teacher, which meant superintendent of the schools, to teach his catechism. He made the creed binding. If you didn't believe in it, you were a heretic, and a heretic could be killed. And he made this consistory, this ruling body, composed not only of the pastors of the church, not only of the teachers of the schools, not only of the deacons who did the benevolent work, but also the elders. And to illustrate his power, all 4 of these groups were on this consistory, and Calvin was the chairman of it. Well, the role of the elders was to enforce discipline. And that involved, you know what we call blue laws 1 day a week? They had blue laws 7 days a week. They regulated all personal behavior, and the elders made a visit to the home at least annually to check up on the habits of the people. The penalties were severe, and they pretty well, I would say, well, the only thing Calvin failed was he tried to institute a total prohibition of liquor, and he couldn't get away with it. Shades of the Prohibition era in America. But most everything he attempted to do, he did succeed, and therefore there was tremendous power in this operation. Now, obviously, it required a great deal of conformity to law. And people would differ on that. Most of the people that went to Geneva during these years would say, the town is serious, it is sober, there aren't any drunkards, there aren't any prostitutes, there aren't all of the flagrant crimes. But, of course, on the other hand, everybody had to conform to this pattern. Which meant that, and by the way, Calvin said the law is in the Bible, the preachers are to interpret the Bible, and the state is to enforce this. Now, that's what we call a theocracy, which meant that Calvin had a system in which he was simply requiring conformity to the Bible by the entire city. Well, the real problem with that, of course, is with the dissenter. What do you do when somebody won't go along? And Calvin was troubled throughout most of this period by heretics. And I think I should take a moment to tell you about one of them, Michael Servetus. Servetus was a brilliant man, widely read, encyclopedic intelligence, but he was a maverick. He didn't get along with anybody. He could find something wrong with everybody's theology. He didn't like the Catholic theology, he didn't like Luther's theology, and he definitely didn't like Calvin's theology. And he was very rambunctious in writing biting letters to attack this theology, and Calvin didn't suffer a lot of objection to his theology. So Servetus was finally excommunicated from the Catholic Church. He was put on the most wanted list. It's so interesting. Today, the most wanted list in our country is people that robbed the bank. In that era, the most wanted list were the heretics that didn't agree with the church. Well, this Servetus got on the Catholic list, so he fled, and so help me, he went to Geneva, disguised himself. Well, for a time he even had a separate career under a different name. But to shorten the story, when he got in Geneva, he disguised himself, and on the last Sunday decided he would go to church to hear Calvin preach so he could find something else to attack, and he was recognized and arrested. Then they went through a long 2-year trial. Calvin wrote a bill of 38 indictments, and he was finally condemned on 2 of them. One, he didn't believe fully in the Trinity, because he wouldn't say the Son was eternal, and he didn't believe in infant baptism. Well, now just kind of think that over a minute. Didn't believe all the deep things about the Trinity and didn't believe in infant baptism. They decided that was punishable by death. Calvin wanted it to be merciful. He said, just behead him. But the tribunal said, no, we must make an example, and so he was burned at the stake. One of the famous heretics to be burned at the stake. And in fact, they put the heretical book in his hand so it would burn up with him. And as the flames licked up his pretty gruesome story, I won't tell, he cried, Lord Christ, and he said, Son of the eternal God. But he wouldn't say eternal Son of God, if you can tell the difference. Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me, and he died. The only footnote to that is that if you go to Geneva now and go outside the city, you'll find a statue erected in 1901 to the memory of Servetus, and it includes in the inscription of friends an apology from John Calvin's church for what they did 400 years ago. Well, with this clear victory over Servetus, Calvin just ruled in Geneva until his death. He was in very frail health, had everything wrong with him, skinny, dried up, emaciated person, had to be carried into the pulpit in a chair but preached 4 times a week, established the University of Geneva, wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible, expanded the Institutes into about 1,200 pages, a 2-volume work, and finally died in 1564. Now, just a word about his contributions. Calvin is best known for his concept of God, and I know you want me to talk about predestination. Basically, Calvin said, God is so great that unless we emphasize His total sovereignty, that He is totally in control of the most minute event, if we don't make God everything, and therefore us nothing, we'll get pride and won't make God supreme. So Calvin emphasized the sovereignty of God, and that was expressed in the view of election. Some are chosen by God, you individually, you Ron, you Clovis, for election, some chosen for damnation. It was eternal, it's immutable, and it's irreversible. Now some of you would say that's repulsive, that our decision, our faith, our response, our repentance, our love doesn't have anything to do with it. And Calvin called it the repugnant doctrine. He said to himself, I know it is repulsive, the horrible decree, he called it. But, he said, such a total show of God's power promotes our admiration of His glory. Now, I think the one thing you need to understand is that with that came a view of the church. If you are in the church, you are in communion with Christ. And if you're in communion with Christ, that's proof you are elected to salvation. So really, rather than wondering, gee, have I been predestined to heaven or hell, what Calvin was really teaching is if you're a good member of the church, you can know that you're elected for heaven. But if you are kicked out of the church because you're defective, you're excommunicated, that is proof you are elected for damnation. Now, do you know what that meant? It meant that it gave the power of excommunication an ultimate, eternal significance. And that's the way Calvin enforced all his blue laws. Discipline could be enforced because they could not stand to be excommunicated. Well, why would people accept that view? For one thing, this was a day when there were no individual rights. And Calvin was saying, you and you and you can now be confident that God has chosen you and that even though you're in a small church, you are bound for eternity. One other thing Calvin did, and not going to be able to develop this, but Calvin said we must be close to church and state. There must be a unity of church and state. So he really did what Luther did, what the Catholics did, and the Reformed. They all had a monopolistic religion. They all were in an organic union with the state. So you need to know that the Reformation did not go as far as the Baptist idea of the separation of church and state. But because the church was responsible for running the state, it gave the Reformed tradition a very lively interest in secular affairs. Calvin regulated the banking laws, Grady. He regulated the interest rates. He regulated usury. He regulated the weaving industry. He regulated the trade routes. And to this day, Presbyterians often take an interest in social affairs because Calvin's view of the church was we are to be responsible for the public order and not just the private order. Well, the irony that I want you to reflect on. Luther started the Reformation by saying, it is a crisis of conscience. Here I stand, even if nobody else is with me, I can do none other. Calvin came along and consolidated the Reformation by giving no liberty to conscience. He said, this is the truth, it is being taught, if you do not follow it, you're a heretic. Which means that the Reformation itself did not solve the problem of the need for cohesive unity of the group versus the private rights of conscience. And that, I think, is where the Baptist witness can be best made, because they never solve the problem of individual liberty of conscience, because they never solve the problem of separation of church and state. That doesn't mean we're better than they are. It means we have a unique witness, never to be forgotten. And sometimes when I preach on why Baptists are in danger of getting the wrong view of church and state, I hope you realize what I'm trying to protect us from.
This concludes Dr. Hall's sermon. We pray that its message has brought new insight to your life. If there is any way that Dr. Hall or our staff may be of Christian service to you, please do not hesitate to call or write us. We will give your inquiry a prompt, courteous, and confidential reply. Our address is First Baptist Church, 543 Ockley Drive, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71106. The telephone number is area code 318-865-8414.